It's hard for me to believe that 15 years after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, when there was a live feed on cable news of a pipeline of oil gushing into the sea for 87 straight days, a pipeline that only existed because a fossil fuel company was giving permission to explore and then poked a hose into the seafloor, it's hard for me to believe that memory has faded so much that we would allow the Republicans to give away a Germany amount of space in the Gulf to fossil fuel companies to do it again, when the technology exists to render all of this unnecessary. And I don't know how to measure the costs of this. The cost of the loss of pristine nature, the loss of animals who don't deserve to be poisoned and to lose their homes, maybe even their whole species. The analysis of the bill only looks at dollars, but there are costs beyond money. And I wish they mattered to Republicans more.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to Congressional Dish 321. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Today, we are going to be talking about the big, beautiful bill. This is going to be part 2 about the money. Today, we're going to talk about the tax cuts for the wealthy, but we'll also talk about the tax increases on the wealthy. We'll talk about the tax cuts for corporations, but we'll also talk about the tax increases for corporations. And then, of course, I will tell you about all the crumbs for us peasants, but I will also tell you about the tax increases that are in there for us as well. And then finally, I'll tell you about the good stuff, because there was some in this overall horrendous scandal of a law. But, like I said, this is part 2 of the big, beautiful bill. Please take the time to listen to Congressional Dish 320, which was called One Big Beautiful Bill, A Dangerous Law. And it doesn't really matter in what order you listen to these episodes, but episode 320, that's the most important episode out of the 2, because those are the provisions with literal life and death consequences. So don't skip that one. And I should tell you that in both episodes, when I talk about numbers, the estimates for how much each of the provisions cost and save are generally reported over 10 years, but not always. And so I'm going to report yearly costs and savings as I go down this list. I will also be reporting numbers for individuals, for single people, because if you're married, the numbers are almost always doubled. And then there's different figures for families. And so to just keep it simple so that we can compare things easily, I'm just going to give you the numbers for single people. But if you do want to see the specifics and how this affects your family in particular, I did put my highlighted PDF of the law in the show notes for you so that you can look through it yourself, along with all of the sources that we used to find out the cost estimates and all the background info, everything we used, all the sound clips are in there, because I feel like trust is earned. And actually, I make it so that you don't really even have to trust me, because I make it really easy for you to check my work. And if you appreciate this work and are paying for it per episode on Patreon, this is where we're going to leave you for a few minutes, because you don't have to listen to pitches for funding. But if you are not paying for the show yet, please do so, because we operate on the value for value funding model, which is a version of the honor system. The Congressional Dish team takes weeks, sometimes even months, to work on these episodes for you. Because I can tell you that this big, beautiful bill has dominated my life for the last 6 weeks. And then we give you an episode about it for free upfront. Much like how you go to a restaurant and you get the food and then you pay. And you get to determine the value of the labor in the form of a tip. We do something similar here in that you get the episode and then you can decide how much it's worth to you. And you can pay that amount with a check or PayPal or Zelle or Venmo or a Chipotle gift card, or by supporting the show regularly on Patreon, which gets you a private feed also without the golf swing censors, without the pitches for funding, and then you also get bonus episodes telling you what happened last week in Congress every time that Congress is in session. But that's how we keep this show ad-free. And this is going to be the only funding pitch you'll hear in this episode. From here on forward, there's no need to touch that fast forward circle on your app. But we think, and have been proven correct, that if we produce something valuable, we think that good people don't need to be forced to pay for it. And so thank you in advance for doing your part. And you can find all the options for joining this community on the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com. And so now let's rejoin our Patreon friends and take a look at the money winners and losers in the big, beautiful law. All right, so let's get started with the tax cuts for the wealthy, since it is estimated that more than half of the financial benefits of this new law are going to go to the top 20% of households by income. So we're going to start with the alternative minimum tax, because right now rich people have to pay something called the alternative minimum tax if they use too many tax tricks to lower what they owe. But the big beautiful law makes it easier for them to avoid paying this tax. It does so by raising the amount of money that they can make before this tax kicks in, because it used to kick in at $500,000 for a married couple, and that has been now raised to $1 million. This is a rule change that will cause fewer rich people to have to pay this tax at all, and because of this, wealthy people will be able to keep more money in their pocket instead of paying it in taxes. This is going to save rich people about $140 billion per year, and this is their biggest tax cut in the law. Next, we have the SALT deduction. And there was a huge fight about this amongst the Republicans as they were writing this bill. But basically, when people pay taxes to their state or their cities or, their local government, they can sometimes get a break on their federal taxes. And that break is called the SALT deduction. Before 2018, there was no limit on how much you could deduct. But then a law changed it and said that you could only take off up to $10,000 of those state and local taxes. And so what the Republicans did is they changed it so that now the limit is $40,000 for the next 5 years. And that limit is going to go up a little bit each year with inflation. And any family that makes less than $500,000 per year can claim that full $40,000 deduction. But even if you're Elon Musk, you can still deduct $10,000 from your federal taxes if you paid state income tax. And then starting in 2029, the limit's scheduled to go back down to $10,000. But this is estimated to cost the federal government $30 billion per year, and I can see why this seems unfair to many people, because it really benefits people in high-income tax states, essentially making the federal government pay for the taxing decisions of the states. And it also gives a lot of money to people who don't really need it because there is no complete phase-out based on income. There are about 1.2 million Americans who make $500,000 per year in salary, and they're all going to be able to get $10,000 credited. That equals $12 billion. Like Mark Zuckerberg, he lives in California, he qualifies. Larry Ellison, he qualifies. Michael Bloomberg, he qualifies. They don't need the money, but they're going to get it. Also, speaking of people who don't need the money, the new big beautiful law allows people to gift up to $15 million to other people, as in their useless children, without paying any taxes on that transfer. The tax-free threshold for gifts from rich people used to be $5 million before this law. And in order to make the original tax cuts for the rich law look less fiscally reckless back in 2017, this literal gift to the rich was set to expire, but now it's not. And so this change is projected to cost $21.2 billion in lost revenue to the government every year, which will remain in rich kids' portfolios. And then there's another benefit for wealthy people that actually is done by them not putting anything in the law, because the Trump tax cuts from his first term temporarily lowered the tax rate for the Americans who make the most money. They lowered the tax rate from 39.6% to 37%, and that was automatically supposed to go back to 39.6% in 2026. But the big beautiful law made that temporary tax cut permanent. So that essentially prevents a 2.6% tax increase on the richest Americans. And this is roughly going to keep about $6 billion per year in the pockets of the richest Americans. The big beautiful law also allows people who own certain stocks, which in reality is generally the upper class Americans, as only about the top 50% of Americans even have any stock. Well, the big beautiful law allows those relatively wealthy people to exclude their stock market gains from, quote, small business stocks, unquote, entirely from counting as income if they held those stocks for more than 5 years. Now, the small businesses whose stocks can be held and then sold 5 years later for profits which won't count as income for investors, are businesses with assets of up to $75 million, and the new law increases that from $50 million. And that $75 million threshold will increase with inflation automatically. But a business that makes $74 million per year, does that sound like a small business to you? Or does that sound like they are dicking around with the definition of small business again to funnel money to investors in mid-sized companies, like tech startups, which have the ability to make tens of millions of dollars per year? Well, anyway, that's how they define small business now. And this part of the law gives a big tax break to people who invest in those so-called small businesses and then sell their shares. So if they keep the stock for at least 3 years, they don't have to pay taxes on half of the money they make. If they keep it for 4 years, they don't have to pay taxes on 75% of the profit. And if they hold it for 5 years, they don't have to pay any taxes on their profit at all. Also, before the big beautiful law, the most someone could avoid taxes on was $10 million per company. Now it's $15 million if the stock is bought after this law was passed, and that amount will increase every year with inflation. And this exclusion is likely to save the investor class over $2 billion per year in taxes. And then there's also a tax break for owners of actual small businesses. So we're talking people like me, a sole proprietor, or partnerships or S corporations, although those aren't necessarily small businesses. But the point I'm trying to make with this is that the people who fall into those categories still are going to get to deduct 20% of their business income from taxes forever. This is called the pass-through deduction, and that was made permanent. Now, before this, if someone made over $50,000 as a single person, the deduction gradually disappeared. But now, starting in 2026, those limits are raised to $75,000 for a single person, and that will be adjusted every year for inflation. But even if someone has just a small amount of business income, like $1,000, they still get to claim at least a $400 deduction. And this piece is helpful, especially for true smaller business owners or gig workers. But here's how this is a tax cut for the rich. Wealthy people often hire lawyers or accountants to structure their businesses to qualify for this deduction. So for example, instead of taking a salary, which doesn't qualify them, they might pay themselves through a pass-through entity like an LLC or an S corporation to get the 20% tax break. And according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, around 61% of the total benefit of the pass-through deduction goes to the top 1% of income earners. And this is expected to cost the government about $600 million a year in lost revenue. Another provision that I consider a tax cut for the wealthy is one related to 529 plans. 529 plans are basically money that can be set aside tax-free and used for education. Now, previously, these were only allowed to cover higher education, but now they can cover private and religious elementary and high schools and be used to pay for tuition, books, tutoring, standardized tests, and therapies for students with disabilities. It also doubles the cap on expenses from $10,000 a year to $20,000 a year. But this is considered a tax cut for the rich because you have to have money left over after paying your regular bills to even have a 529 plan to fund. And so many families earning under $100,000 a year, they can't afford private school or 529 plans anyway, and so they're not going to benefit much from this. And so even though lower and middle class people could use this tax provision, the reality is that it's used much more often by the rich. And we are going to lose collectively $100 million in tax money to subsidize the education of the rich, including private and religious schools. And so when you add it all up, the total of direct tax cuts to wealthy people that I just told you about is about $200 billion a year. But what I discovered, which goes against the narrative, is that there were some tax increases on the wealthy too. So there's one in here that adds a new rule for rich people that says that if you're in the highest tax bracket, you can only take 35 cents off of your taxes for every $1 of deductions instead of 37 cents. So like if you donated to charity or paid state taxes. Let's say a very rich person gave $1,000 to charity. Under the old rules, they might have been able to subtract all $1,000 from their taxable income. But under the new rule, they can only subtract $350 from their income because that's 35% of that $1,000. And so the effect of this is that there is going to be a permanent lower cap on the tax deductions of the rich. And that is expected to raise about $25.6 billion per year in revenues to the government. This part of the law also changes how much people can take off their taxes when they give money directly to charity. So for someone who itemizes their deductions, which means that they list out their tax write-offs one by one, which is something that only about 10% of us do, and most of us who do it are wealthy. Well, for the people in that category, the amount that they can take off for charity will be slightly reduced by 0.5% of their income. And so if someone gives a lot to charity, they won't get quite as big of a tax break as before. But at the same time, the law keeps a rule that lets people give more money to charities using cash and still get a tax break for it. And that rule was supposed to expire, but now it's permanent. But essentially taken together, charitable giving changes are expected to raise an additional $6.3 billion per year from the wealthy. And then when someone owns a business and loses money, like if their business costs more to run than it earns, they can usually subtract that loss from their other income to lower their taxes. But there's a limit on how much those business losses they can use each year. And so it's up to $313,000 per year for a single person, double that for a married couple. Now, if a business loses more than that, the extra loss can't be used right away to lower their taxes, but you're allowed to save it and use it to lower your taxes in future years. Now, that limit was supposed to expire in 2029, but now it's permanent. And so keeping the limit on how and when business losses can be subtracted from their income is expected to cost wealthy people about $1.8 billion a year in taxes. And so when you look at all that stuff I just told you together, I just told you about a direct tax increase for the wealthy of about $33.7 billion a year. But the bill gives them $200 billion. And so when you look at that together, the wealthy roughly are going to keep about $166 billion per year. Now, like I said before, these are super, super rough numbers, and I'm not telling you about every single tax provision in this law, but I do think I got most of the big stuff here. But the point that I'm trying to make with these numbers is that it's clear that the wealthy definitely net benefit from the big, beautiful law. That's real. So the reputation of this law being beneficial to the wealthy, overwhelmingly to the wealthy, I think we can call that accusation true. Especially after you look at all the tax cuts for businesses. Some wealthy people will benefit even more because of their businesses. But it really depends on what business you're in, whether or not this law helps or hurts you. Because the Republicans definitely picked winners and losers with this one. And so let's see who the Republicans stacked the deck for. Now, right now, when a business buys something big, like a machine or a truck, it usually can't subtract the full cost of that from its taxes all at once. Instead, it has to spread out the tax break over several years, depending on how long the item is expected to last. But for certain types of things, like machines or equipment that last 20 years or less, businesses are allowed to subtract a big part of the cost right away in the same year that they start using it. This is called a bonus depreciation or immediate expensing. Now, the current rule before the big, beautiful law only let them subtract 40% of the cost right away. In 2026, that number was supposed to drop to 20, and then in 2027, go away completely. But the new law changes that. And so starting in 2025, immediately, businesses will be able to subtract 100% of those costs right away, permanently, for things like machines and equipment. They will also get to immediately deduct domestic research and development costs. And so these two corporate tax gifts are expected to reduce taxes paid by corporations by roughly $50 billion a year. And some of that money will flow to investor portfolios. Republicans also lowered the rate that fossil fuel companies have to pay us for using our land and offshore ocean to drill for oil and gas. So they're going to go from having to pay 16% to 12% in royalties. They also eliminated the payments fossil fuel companies are required to pay for methane that is vented, flared, or burned due to their own negligence. The Republicans also lowered the rate that coal mining companies have to pay us for destroying our land from 12% to 7% in royalties for the next decade. And that is retroactive to all coal leases, even ones issued before this became law. And coal companies that paid royalties in advance will get a credit for the difference. Now, no fossil fuel subsidy analysis was done for the final version of this law. And it really does depend on how much the industry drills and burns, and that's not something we can know yet. But using the royalties that the government collected in 2024 and reported to the Interior Department, I calculated that if these changes were in effect last year, it would have cost the government $3.1 billion in fossil fuel royalties, $1 billion in methane royalties, and $195 million in coal royalties. And so my very rough back of the napkin numbers, which I think are a good educated guess, my guess is that the big beautiful law gifted the fossil fuel industry with about $4.3 billion per year. The big beautiful law also adds expenses tied to drilling wells and preparing oil and gas properties to the list of deductible costs for the fossil fuel companies. And the effect of this is that it's going to encourage further investment in oil and gas development and well drilling by reducing the tax burdens of these companies. This is another fossil fuel favor that hasn't yet been analyzed for how much it's going to cost us, and I had no way to do back of the napkin math for this one. Moving away from fossil fuels, this law also gives businesses a bigger tax break when they spend money to build or upgrade factories that make advanced technology like computer chips. So before, these companies could get back 25% of the cost of their factory upgrades through a tax credit. Now they're going to get back 35% of what they spend starting in 2026. And that's a subsidy for factories that's going to cost us approximately $4 billion a year in lost tax revenue. The Republicans also increased a tax credit for foreign taxes paid by multinational corporations. And so before this law, multinational corporations could get credit for 80% of the foreign taxes that they paid. Now they can get a credit for 90%, which means they're going to pay less in U.S. taxes on money they earn from other countries. And this will cost us approximately $2.5 billion per year in lost revenue, money that can be passed out to multinational shareholders. And up next, we have a favor to the fishing industry. And this has to do with meal deductions. And so in general, business meals are usually allowed to be partially written off, so 50% of the expense. But the new law allows meals provided on a fishing boat or at a fish processing facility to be 100% written off as a business expense. And the government's going to lose about $540 million per year on average due to this gift to the fishing industry. Now, in the House version of the bill, the original version, the 100% deduction for meals was going to apply much more broadly to a lot more businesses, including mine. But in the end, it only applied to the fishing industry. Why? Well, to get Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska to vote for the bill, even though she knew it was going to hurt millions of Americans because of the effective cuts to food allowances and healthcare coverage. She said she didn't like this bill. She thought it was a bad bill. But she got favors for her state and for her donors, included in the bill by the Republican senators, and so she voted for it, and now it's law. And this was one of those donor-flavored favors. Speaking of donor favors, the Republicans also provided tax-exempt bonds that will cause spaceports, which includes launch sites and hangars and control towers and other space launch infrastructure, to be funded just like airports. Now, the way this works is that these bonds let investors loan money to build spaceports and pay no federal tax on the interest that they earn. And this will reduce revenue to the government by about $100 million per year in the hopes that private investment will flow to create spaceport infrastructure. Now, the spaceports are not just for NASA, because SpaceX uses our spaceports and lately has damaged at least 3 of them thanks to their explosions. And I do remember years ago when I read the Farm Bill that our tax money pays for damage caused by private spaceflight companies, SpaceX, that exceeds their insurance coverage. And so essentially, we are subsidizing Elon Musk's business in multiple ways. And this further expands his subsidies by helping pay for the infrastructure that he needs at no cost to his company. Another industry that gives a lot of money to Republicans and that benefits from this law is the banking industry. And so what the Republicans did for them is that they gave a tax break to banks and lenders when they make loans to help people buy or improve farmland or rural property in the United States, which includes property used for fishing and seafood processing. Now, if a bank gives out this kind of loan, it can skip paying taxes on 25% of the interest it earns from that loan. But to get the tax break, the loan must be made between now and the end of the Trump administration, and it's not allowed to involve any foreign-owned businesses that the U.S. considers a risk. And this is going to be a $25 million per year subsidy to the banks. And so to summarize, the Big Beautiful Law gives significant tax breaks to the fossil fuel industry, technology manufacturers, multinational corporations, the fishing industry, Elon Musk, and the banks. But while those industries get favors, other industries are going to get tax punishments. So the industry that gets punished the worst is the wind and solar industries. Because what the Republicans did is they killed production and investment tax credits for wind and solar projects that are placed in service after December 31st, 2027. And I know for a fact that these projects take years to plan and to build. And so this effectively kills the tax credits for any new large projects. And this is fucking up the financials for projects that are in the early stages now. Full disclosure here, my husband is a utility scale solar engineer. This has ruined our month because all the projects he's been working on, the financials are just a mess now because of this law. And actually, it's worse than that because this law makes sure that projects that have already been in progress are going to be screwed up because projects that begin construction after July 4th, 2026, that's less than a year from now. They're only going to get 60% of their expected credit. And then projects that begin construction in 2027 will only get 20% of their expected credit. So you can imagine that this is messing with their financials. Even worse than that, it eliminates tax credits for any project that has, quote, material assistance, unquote, from a prohibited foreign entity. And the language is very strict, which is a problem because China makes most of the world's solar panels. So this is drastically limiting solar panel supply options for projects in the United States. And that is because we don't have a domestic industry that can fill the gaps in solar panel production. There are only a few companies that make solar panels in the United States, and they are already pulling monopoly moves, like requiring companies that buy their solar panels to also use their construction company, even if that company sucks. And so this is going to require so much work, as I am personally witnessing, for people in the solar and wind industry. The solar and wind companies will have to audit their supply chains and origin trace every single component of their projects, and the documentation standards aren't even yet in existence. And so while creating a new accelerated timeline for every project, the people working on these projects don't know how to comply with the rules. Like, this is all designed for them to fail. And on top of that, they also make some projects constructed with third-party leasing or power purchase agreements ineligible for investment credits. Now, I won't go too far into the weeds here because I could, but let me just say this. This is a full-blown attack on solar and wind energy. It's designed to make as many solar and wind projects as possible fail. Now, nuclear energy, geothermal, those remain untouched. This is an attack on wind and solar in particular. And I've got to tell you, if my husband and I have to brain drain out of the United States to find him a job outside of this corrupt, backwards-looking country, this law is going to be a pivotal reason for it. Because even if the Trump administration ends and the pendulum swings back again to giving a damn about renewable energy and solving the climate crisis and all these things, the uncertainty of how we are governing makes it impossible for companies to plan long-term in the United States. But just financially, without even thinking of those long-term problems, this is going to take about $19 billion per year away from the solar and wind industries. They're also attacking residential solar because the Republicans killed the residential clean energy tax credit, which allowed homeowners to claim a 30% federal credit for solar power equipment installed in their primary residence. This credit was supposed to exist until the end of 2034, but this is going to be the last year instead. And so this is going to take $7.7 billion per year out of energy-conscious homeowner pockets. Moving on from energy, starting in 2026, the Republicans also decided to reduce the amount that multinational corporations can deduct from income from exports of U.S.-produced items and passive income earned from foreign subsidies. So this essentially increased the tax on profits earned overseas, and this is going to raise about $5.5 billion per year. Also starting in 2026, a corporation will not be able to deduct any charitable giving unless its total contributions exceed 1% of its taxable income. Now, there was already a cap in place preventing a corporation from donating and deducting more than 10% of its income. And so basically, only corporate donations between 1% and 10% of their taxable income are immediately deductible. They're allowed to donate more, but they would have to get the deductions for the amounts over that cap taken out over the next 5 years. They couldn't do it just right away. And so the cap is not the issue. The floor is. The floor means that any business that gives away less than 1% of its income can't deduct any of that giving from their taxes, which could reduce charitable donations by businesses. But this will cause corporations to pay an additional $1.7 billion per year in taxes. The Republicans also closed a loophole that was used by corporations to get around a cap on deductions of $1 million, as long as they couldn't deduct more than $1 million for an executive's salary. Now, they were getting around this and deducting $1 million per executive more than once by using reporting gimmicks, using subsidiaries and shell companies. And I don't really get it. I don't know how this works. But what matters is that now they won't be able to do that anymore. And this is expected to raise taxes on corporations who were cheating on their taxes by about $1.5 billion per year. The Republicans also decided that universities with more than 3,000 students with an endowment, which is assets unrelated to educating students. Well, if a university has an endowment that is worth more than $500,000 per student, they are going to be taxed on their endowments starting in 2026. And the maximum tax rate will be 8% of their net investment income. So that'll be applied to the big ones like Harvard, which has an endowment larger than $2 million per student. And this is expected to raise about $1 billion per year from universities. And I gotta say, the universities have a way to get around this, which is that they can admit more students and use more money on their students. The Republicans also decided that foreign profits from royalty or rent-generating assets will no longer be eligible for some tax deductions. Now, the date that this is effective is June 2025, so that is in the past. And that prevents people from selling off assets before the deadline because that deadline was before the date of enactment of this law. And so if you didn't sell your assets already, too bad. And what this is going to mean is essentially higher taxes for Americans who bought properties overseas for the passive income of Airbnbs, because they won't be able to claim deductions for that rental income anymore. And this is expected to raise about $760 million per year in revenue to the government. Also affecting taxes paid on stuff sold overseas is the foreign sourced inventory provision. So before, the U.S. multinationals might be able to treat a large portion of income from their U.S.-made goods sold abroad as foreign sourced, which would maximize their foreign tax credit. So if they paid more in taxes in the country where the store is than the U.S. tax rate, then the company could owe nothing to the United States. But the big, beautiful law reduced the amount of sales of U.S.-made inventory sold in foreign locations that multinationals can claim as foreign income from 100% to 50%. They cut it in half. And so this means that the company that paid taxes to the other country might have to send money to the United States as well, even if they already paid taxes that are higher than the U.S. corporate tax rate. Now, the idea behind this is that this increases taxes on multinationals that sell U.S.-made items abroad in order to combat profit shifting through foreign branches. But this could backfire and encourage companies to produce more of their products outside of the United States to prevent being taxed because their stuff is U.S. made. And this is really only expected to raise less than $1 billion per year for the government. And so if this encourages some companies to stop producing products here, this tax increase really might not be worth it. This could be far more damaging than helpful. Speaking of more damaging than helpful, the Republicans also killed the tax credit for clean hydrogen production facilities that do not begin construction before January 1st, 2028, which is 5 years early. And this is going to take about $600 million per year out of the clean hydrogen industry. And I do have to note that dirty hydrogen remains untouched, proving once again that the Republicans are the party of pollution. The Republicans also attacked energy efficiency efforts because if you start constructing a commercial building after June 30th, 2026, you will no longer be allowed to claim the tax deduction for energy-saving upgrades like efficient lighting, HVAC systems, or insulation. And so there's still time to claim those, but this was supposed to be effective until forever. It was supposed to be permanent, but that's no longer the case. And so businesses who missed out will either pay more out of pocket to make the upgrades or just pay more for energy. Either way, they lose. And this is expected to raise about $13.4 million per year in taxes. Republicans also decided to repeal what remains of over $5 billion for clean energy demonstration projects. They also repealed the rest of $3 billion, which was for retrofitting car manufacturing facilities to help them transition to producing electric vehicles. Because, electric vehicles, that's the wrong kind of corporate welfare. They also decided to take back what remains of $600 million for the government to replace fossil fuel guzzlers with clean, heavy vehicles. And they repealed what remains of $2 billion for the construction or modification of electric transmission facilities, which I know is necessary to make the grid compatible with renewable energy systems. And that money was supposed to be available until the end of 2030. They also repealed what remains of $760 million that was being spent to plan for future interstate and offshore electricity transmission infrastructure upgrades, making this job even harder in the future. And on top of that, they repealed what remains of $200 million for training and education to contractors involved with installing home energy efficiency upgrades. And even the fossil fuel industry is going to take a hit here because while they are a huge recipient of corporate welfare in this law, they got to reduce their tax payments that they had to pay in return for using and spoiling our land, and they had a bunch of fees eliminated. While they were helping the industry in that way, the Republicans decided to stop the fossil fuel corporate welfare that protects us from their poisons. Because what the Republicans chose to do was repeal what was left of $5 billion for equipment to upgrade and clean fossil fuel energy infrastructure that was supposed to, quote, sequester air pollutants or anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, unquote. So much corporate welfare for fossil fuels in this law. Like, why repeal this unless you really are the pro-pollution party? If we're going to invest more in this destructive energy, can't we at least make it as clean as possible? Like, why is that too much to ask from Republicans? I really don't understand it. And while we're on the topic of pollution, the Republicans also took back what remains of an $850 million fund to pay fossil fuel corporations to monitor their methane emissions, to reduce those emissions, and to reduce pollution from oil and gas systems. So that would be like permanently shutting old oil wells and restoring the environment. So even if these companies want to continue monitoring their emissions and cleaning up their act, the Republicans are purposefully making that more expensive for them to do. Now, so far, we've largely been talking about cuts, but this law also invests our tax money in favored industries. And so let's check out who will be receiving money from the Republicans' new law. So first, it changes the purpose of fossil fuel energy reinvestment programs from being investments in projects that bring broken fossil fuel energy infrastructure back to life and limit their pollution and emissions to instead increasing the output from those facilities. And in case you have any doubt that eliminating pollution limits is a goal, they straight up delete the requirement that, quote, electricity generation through the use of fossil fuels shall be required to have controls or technologies to avoid, reduce, utilize, or sequester air pollutants and anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, unquote. And they also deleted a requirement that applications to reopen dirty zombie fossil fuel energy facilities include, quote, an analysis of how the proposed project will engage with and affect associated communities, unquote. And we've seen this so many times already in this law and in Republican bills going back a decade and Trump administration actions. But this is a pattern. If they think the facts will make their plans look bad, they simply hide the facts. And so in this case, they just won't analyze how these actions are going to affect us. And then finally, the Republicans expand the projects subject to these rules to allow mining facilities without pollution limits as well. And then they appropriated $1 billion of our tax dollars to this pro-pollution cause. In another gift to the fossil fuel industry, the Republicans enabled cheap land grabs. The way this works is that the Inflation Reduction Act had eliminated non-competitive leasing for onshore oil and gas. In effect, since August 2022, the Bureau of Land Management has only been allowed to lease our land to fossil fuel companies via competitive leases. So no first come, first served direct leases to favored companies who simply asked for them. The ban on non-competitive leasing was designed to ensure that we, the public, get fair market rates on all of the land that we allow the fossil fuel companies to spoil for profit. So the land would have to be offered to everyone, and then companies would compete for it by offering the government fair prices for what is essentially rent. But the Republicans, in the law that they call beautiful, decided to bring back non-competitive leases for fossil fuel companies. In effect, this means favored fossil fuel companies won't have to offer their best possible prices to us because the Trump administration will be allowed to just give the leases first come, first served, which is a rigged game if only one company knows there's a line. And let me be blunt about this. Letting companies land grab without competition rips off the government. No good faith steward of government finances would do this, especially considering that the industry that benefits is one that causes so much expensive damage to this country via pollution and increased frequency and intensity of storms. And while I'm hugging this tree, let me also tell you that this part of the Big Beautiful Law is a sneaky direct attack on the environment because competitive leasing includes environmental review processes, often requiring public input. Non-competitive leasing can sometimes skip these environmental reviews, allowing environmentally disastrous plans to get through a corrupt, corporate-captured administration like the Trump administration without public knowledge or opportunity to intervene. And these land giveaways, they aren't optional. They are requirements. The Big Beautiful Law says the Secretary of the Interior shall conduct at least 4 lease sales every year to fossil fuel companies in each of the following states: Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Alaska. That's 36 plots of land per year required to be given away for cheap to fossil fuel companies. And how much land are we talking about here? Well, the Big Beautiful Law changes the law to require the Secretary of the Interior make all land that is known to have oil or gas underneath it available for leasing if a fossil fuel company expresses interest in it, or at least all land that isn't prohibited to be offered to them by law. So like national parks are not eligible for this, but the land just outside them is. And this is a change because before this law, making all land up for grabs was an option for the Secretary of the Interior, but now it's a requirement, which means that any administration after this one that gives a shit about the environment will have their hands tied. They're going to be legally forced to offer all of our drillable land to the fossil fuel companies. And just think about that for a second. 2 months ago, there was public land with oil and gas under it that was off limits to fossil fuel companies for reasons. Because the oil was under a beach. Because oil is under BLM land where sensitive species live. Because the land is used by the public for enjoying life, for hiking, for camping. But the Republicans are requiring land that was protected so recently to just be given away to the worst possible companies, to pollution machines. And the cherry on top, the companies don't even have to say pretty please. In fact, the Big Beautiful Law even eliminates a fee they used to have to pay that helped pay the costs of the leasing process. And it's not just land, oh no. Offshore in our oceans, the Big Beautiful Law requires the leasing of at least 80 million acres in what the bill actually calls the Gulf of America. And just so you can understand how huge an area that is, that's the size of Utah and Colorado combined. And for our friends outside of Uncle Sam's bubble here, that's about the size of Germany. But in case that's not enough for the fossil fuel companies, the Big Beautiful Law ensures that if there isn't that much Gulf of America space left to lease, then the Secretary of the Interior shall, no choice, shall offer, quote, all unleased and available acres, unquote. And there's a similar deal for the pristine waters off the shores of Alaska. The Secretary shall offer 1 million acres, or if there aren't that many acres available, then all of it. It's hard for me to believe that 15 years after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, when there was a live feed on cable news of a pipeline of oil gushing into the sea for 87 straight days, a pipeline that only existed because a fossil fuel company was giving permission to explore and then poked a hose into the seafloor, it's hard for me to believe that memory has faded so much that we would allow the Republicans to give away a Germany amount of space in the Gulf to fossil fuel companies to do it again, when the technology exists to render all of this unnecessary. And I don't know how to measure the costs of this. The cost of the loss of pristine nature, the loss of animals who don't deserve to be poisoned and to lose their homes, maybe even their whole species. The analysis of the bill only looks at dollars, but there are costs beyond money. And I wish they mattered to Republicans more. And this is out of order because this is the opposite of an investment, but I want to tell you now that while Republicans are giving land away to and reducing the taxes of an industry that poisons our air and water and is accelerating the rate that our climate is changing to a rate that there is serious doubt about our ability to adapt, Well, the Republicans are simultaneously going to start charging rent to solar and wind companies that operate on federal lands. And the rent begins before they are producing energy, and so the Republicans are adding extra costs to the part of the project that isn't yet profitable. And there are late payment fees and a clause that allows the administration to kill the renewable energy lease entirely if the rent isn't paid in 90 days. And while the lease sales for fossil fuel projects are forced, with minimums required in both acreage and number of sales every year, when it comes to renewables, the language is all may, not shall. And the fiscal tragedy of charging higher rent to solar and wind companies is that the Congressional Budget Office doesn't even think that this is going to increase funding to our government at all. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, that increasing fees would result in no new money, but think about it for a second. The fees are only paid by companies building solar and wind projects. And so if there are fewer projects, then there are fewer fees to be paid, even if those fees are higher. And so the goal of this isn't to bring in revenue. The goal is to damage the solar and wind industries. This is another section that makes that crystal clear. And so now let's move on to an industry that is struggling in no small part due to increasingly chaotic weather patterns. Droughts, floods, fires. I'm talking about agribusiness. Now, our taxes already pay for a big chunk of crop insurance premiums and payouts. And as we examine crop insurance, please keep in mind that crop insurance isn't designed for and often isn't held by very small, like family farms or farmers markets. 80% of crop insurance is held by the big industrial farming companies. This is about big business, not down-home Americans living on a field of dreams. And I don't think we often enough examine the gift that we give to agribusiness corporations, that is crop insurance. For these companies, tax money goes in to pay not just for their losses, but also their premiums. Premium payments that this law makes even more generous. And then that money can go out the other end to investors. This Republicans provide more money for. While in the same bill, they take away the help that we get for our health insurance premiums, which is a situation where tax money goes in and on the other end pays for our cancer treatments. They will fund the situation where the money gets funneled to the investor class, but they defund the cancer treatments. This is how we know who they serve. But anyway, back to the changes that they made to crop insurance. The increased tax money for their premiums, that was just part of the gift. Because if farmers don't earn enough from selling their crops because prices fall below a government-determined price, the government crop insurance gives them tax money to make up the difference. Well, what the Republicans did is they raised that price level for all major crops, making it easier for agribusiness corporations to get government money. And starting in 2031, those price levels increase with inflation to make sure that the agribusiness corporations can continue to get the tax money at the same level of ease. The Republicans also raised the total amount any one agribusiness corporation can receive by 25%, and then adjusts that cap every year for inflation too. And so, grow less food successfully, get more money. We're literally giving them money for nothing. And other insurance programs like dairy insurance, that's going to get more tax money too. And the bill sets aside an extra $50 million to help cover the start of this higher subsidy level. And a couple of specific agribusiness sectors got special favors. So first, the livestock industry, the growers of cows. The Big Beautiful Law expands eligibility for cow corporations to get payments. So first, they're going to be paid for dead unborn livestock for the first time. So, a pregnant cow dies, and that cow is a 2-for-1 deal, because the cow fetus that never ate a single piece of food and never occupied an inch of grazing land, well, that's going to be paid for by us taxpayers as if it were $3,000 worth of beef. And in calculating those payments, the Big Beautiful Law allows the livestock industry to get 100% of the market rate for the cattle they lost in some cases. So they will be required to take no loss whatsoever. And in the case of drought, it expands eligibility for payments and in some cases doubles their payment amounts. And get this, the market rate used to determine their payouts can now be calculated in ways that allow the producers to be paid above the national market rate. Like they're given legal permission to rip us off. This is legislative gangster shit. And joining the gangsters in paradise in this law is also the fishing industry. Again, thank you, Lisa Murkowski. This fishy flavor expands coverage for the farmed fishing industry to include losses due to birds that eat the fish. And they set a minimum amount for payments to the fishing industry. Not a maximum, a minimum. The sky is the upper limit, up there with all those profit-eating birds. And it's not just the agribusiness corporations who get crop insurance who are funneled tax money in this law. The crop insurance companies themselves are getting a raise. Starting in 2026, the government must pay some insurance companies an additional 6% to cover their administrative and operating expenses for managing the crop insurance program, and the payments must increase with inflation every year. And the Republicans are going to increase the customer base because they created a pilot program for poultry growers to get insurance for extreme weather that raises their energy costs. And so, in summary, us taxpayers will be paying even more to subsidize crops and food animals that sometimes won't even exist. And this is an increasingly common problem in part because of an increasingly chaotic climate, a problem that this same law is likely to make worse. And I couldn't find an analysis of all these agricultural investments separately, but together, us taxpayers are going to subsidize the farming and animals for eating industries with an additional $5.2 billion-ish every year. And just when you think we're done with tax money for agribusiness, there's $285 million per year that must be spent on expanding commercial markets for U.S. agricultural products. So $285 million in taxpayer-provided international marketing. Damn, it must feel good to be a gangster. And speaking of gangsters, the big beautiful law forces us to spend an additional $15 billion per year on war, on top of the trillion or so that we spend on war every year now. This war money is going to be specifically for the Coast Guard, military housing, Navy ships, new AI-powered death machines, nuclear weapons infrastructure, and $25 billion more for munitions. And let's not forget how we are funding the defense of Ukraine and the genocide by Israel. We send them munitions from our shelves, and then Congress spends more money on munitions to replace those. And so there's an excellent chance that that money isn't really an investment in protecting us. It could be a runaround way to give more money to Ukraine and Israel and any other war they're trying to fund. And you should know that there is a separate $25 billion that's going to be spent on the so-called Golden Dome, which is a space-based missile shield that is theoretically going to intercept missiles before they hit the United States. And what decade do the Republicans think we're living in with this Star Wars bullshit? Wars of the future are AI drones and robots and shutting down each other's electricity grids. This just looks like a money funnel from our pockets to Lockheed Martin's shareholders to me. And the almost $10 billion that must be spent on missions to Mars, well, that sure sounds like a money funnel to Elon Musk. Not only because that Republican Party funding dork is obsessed with the idea of humans on Mars, but also because $700 million of that must be spent on a high-performance Mars communications orbiter that must be purchased from the private sector. And NASA, they couldn't even create that in-house. Now, that concept sounds a lot like SpaceX's MarsLink concept to me, which would be a satellite relay network around Mars, kind of like a Martian Starlink. And on top of that, there's an additional $325 million that is specifically ordered to fulfill a specific contract that was granted in 2024 to SpaceX. And so, as you see, this law wasn't just about tax cuts. There were investments in it too. And that is what is being paid for with the lives of Americans who will be lost because they couldn't pay for food or medical care anymore. And so now, let's look at the goodies for you and I and see if their lives are worth these prizes that we're going to get. And it's in this crumbs for us peasants category where I think this talking point is going to come back to bite the Democrats in their asses. So you're about to hear from Senator Chuck Schumer, Senator Gary Peters, Senator Patty Murray, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, all Democrats. But I can tell you this talking point has been coming from pretty much all of them.
And why are they doing all this? Why are they doing all this? We know why. Tax breaks for billionaires. Tax breaks for billionaires.
They're doing it for tax cuts for billionaires.
Those are just tax cuts for the billionaires, not for working families.
It is the world's worst tax policy. It takes an already corrupted tax code and bends it even further in the favor of mega billionaires.
And I think that talking point is problematic because come April, come tax day, most Americans are going to be pleased to discover that the standard deduction, which is the standard amount that we are allowed to subtract from our tax bills, that's going to be permanently increasing. So for a single person, the standard deduction for 2026 and beyond increases from $12,000 to $15,759 per person, and that will increase with inflation. On top of that, for Americans over the age of 65 with income less than $75,000 per year, they will be able to deduct $6,000 from their taxes. That's a maximum of $1,320 per senior saved in taxes. This was the Republicans' way of trying to appease seniors who were promised no taxes on Social Security, a promise broken by President Trump and the Republicans since no tax on Social Security wasn't allowed in the big, beautiful bill because of their choice to use the reconciliation process to pass it, which was a process that essentially allowed them to cut the Democrats out of the process completely. And for some reason, the Republicans seem unwilling to try to get no tax on Social Security into law on its own, because I actually think the Democrats would be down with that idea. But so far, that doesn't seem to be happening. But back to the $6,000 for seniors that did become law, that's not a permanent tax deduction. This deduction is only valid until the end of the Trump administration. And another promise made by Republicans that they only enacted temporarily is no tax on tips. For the tax years that make up the Trump administration, there will be a deduction for tips capped at $25,000. And that gets reduced for individuals who make more than $150,000 per year. So in reality, if you do the math, this translates into a maximum of $6,000 in actual cash savings for tipped workers. Now, most people will get less, but it depends on your income. And so who qualifies as a tipped worker? Well, I can tell you that even though a significant portion of my income is voluntarily paid, and many of you consider me a tipped worker because you literally send me tips all the time, I can tell you that I don't count. Even though the legal definition of what qualifies as a tip is, quote, an amount paid voluntarily without any consequence in the event of non-payment, is not the subject of a negotiation and is determined by the payer, unquote. Now, I don't think that definition fits our Patreon payments to Congressional Dish because you do lose access to the private feed in the case of non-payment. But the money that you send in via Venmo, paper checks, Cash App, Zelle, doesn't it seem like by definition those should count as tips for people like me? Well, they don't, because there's a section in here that says this is only going to be for people who work in restaurants or in the beauty industry. And like I said, this is only valid until the end of the Trump administration, and so for 4 years. But I do have to admit that I'm personally a little bit bitter because that's potentially $24,000 that I will have to pay in taxes that others who work for tips won't have to pay because their tips are considered more tippy than mine by the Republicans. But for my friends who are still in the restaurant industry and in the beauty industry, because I used to work in both, I am happy you guys will be getting a break. I do know how hard it is to live off of the voluntary payments of others and the financial insecurity that comes along with this business model. And I'm genuinely happy for you. And that's the same for those who work overtime and who will now be able to deduct $12,500 in overtime pay, with that number decreasing if you make over $150,000 a year. That's a maximum of $3,000 cash that might be able to stay in your pockets, but only during the Trump administration each year. This one also expires after 2028. And by the way, the temporary nature of these tax cuts, this has been a Democratic Party talking point as well. Here's Senator Jeff Merkley.
Provisions that were sweeteners to say we were helping working people are being phased out, but they're keeping all the tax breaks for billionaires.
But let me let you in on the game that's being played here, which is a game the Democrats are well aware of. Because in order to make this law look less expensive than it is, the Republicans purposefully let the most popular tax cuts expire in just a few years. That way, all of the analysis of their bill will only look at the financial impact of these tax cuts for 4 years instead of 10, which lowers the total debt that this will theoretically add to our nation's credit card. By only counting 4 years, no tax on tips is said to cost a total of $32 billion, instead of $80 billion over 10 years. By only counting 4 years, no tax on overtime is said to cost a total of $90 billion, instead of $224 billion over 10 years. You see the game? But in reality, these probably won't be temporary. The game being played here politically is that they know that it will be political suicide to let no tax on tips and no tax on overtime expire at the end of 2028, which would cause an increase in taxes on workers a few months after a presidential election. And so what Republicans are counting on is that these tax cuts will probably become permanent sometime in the next 3 years. And we have seen tax cuts become permanent quite a few times, quietly, as dingleberries to government funding laws, usually during a shutdown crisis. And by doing it this way, the big beautiful bill looks less fiscally reckless than it actually is. So basically, the expiration dates are a budget gimmick hidden inside of a political trap. And that is worth keeping in mind as we hear about other temporary measures in this law, and when the Democrats emphasize that corporate tax cuts were permanent and worker tax cuts were temporary. It's technically true, but they know what's really going on. And so, now let's get back to the worker-friendly provisions in the big beautiful law. The Republicans also made some changes to reporting requirements, and these will reduce some of our paperwork burdens. So before the big beautiful law, businesses had to file paperwork with the IRS when payments to an independent contractor or other payee reached $600 or more in a year. Starting in 2026, that threshold is increased to $2,000 per payee per year, and that will increase with inflation. And the Republicans are also reducing reporting requirements that could help gig workers dodge taxes. So Republicans put the requirement back to where it used to be for payments made via PayPal, Venmo, Uber, Etsy, basically the gig economy payment processors. That means that those companies will only have to report your transactions if you made more than $20,000 via more than 200 transactions on their platform that year. For the last few years, if you made more than $6,000 on any of those platforms, your financials had to be reported to the IRS. Now, you still have to pay taxes on all of those transactions, but it reduces paperwork for companies, therefore saving companies money, and probably makes tax dodging using these platforms a bit harder to catch. And this is retroactive, so it's as if the $600 reporting threshold had never existed, wiping away any need to comply for anyone who just didn't over the last few years. And so I do see this as a reward for cheaters, which for the Trump years is so on brand. And when I think of gig economy workers, a lot of the people I think of are drivers. And upon first glance, there's a tax provision in here that will help some drivers. Because the big beautiful law allows $10,000 worth of interest on a car loan to be deducted from a person's taxes. And that amount is reduced for an individual who makes more than $100,000. But in dollars saved, that $10,000 deduction is equal to between $1,000 and $3,700 per person, depending on factors. But let's take a closer look at what is being subsidized, because it's not the car. The money pays for the bank income. It pays for the interest on the loan. That's what our tax money is essentially going to subsidize. And so in a way, it's forcing me to pay, in loss of essential services like a healthcare safety net, for someone else's decision to buy a car they can't afford. Because again, this isn't a subsidy to help you buy a car. If you purchase a car that you can afford in cash, you get nothing. It specifically has to be purchased by going into debt to the banks. The debt to the bank is the action that we're encouraging here. And they're doing this in the same exact bill that killed the tax credit for new and used electric vehicles, credits that were supposed to last until 2032, but now are going to end on September 30th of this year. That money was meant to help us pay for actual cars, not interest on the debt for buying an electric car. We were given a subsidy for the car itself. But now, thanks to the Republicans, our tax money is going to subsidize going into debt to buy any kind of car, including polluting fossil fuel guzzlers. And if you don't go into debt to the banks, well, no tax money for you. And this is another tax change that expires at the end of the Trump administration. or will be a subsidy that's popular with the banks and indebted drivers and will get extended via Dingleberry. We'll just have to wait and see. And so now let's move on to the provisions intended to help parents. And to their credit, the Republicans did. So first, they made permanent and increased the child tax credit from $2,000 per child to $2,200 per child, which will increase along with inflation every year. But they also did a few things that are kind of shitty in regards to the child tax credit. So first, the refundable tax credit, so the kind you can get regardless of how much you pay in taxes, that's capped at $1,400 per year, which is a cap that I will say is going to increase with inflation. But the lower cap means that the lowest income people, so these are the people who make so little that they don't pay much in taxes, well, this is the group of people who will benefit the least because they don't have a tax bill to wipe out that lets them get the full $2,200 credit. They basically get shorted $800. And the Republicans also made the child tax credit impossible for approximately 4.5 million families to get because it now requires both parents, instead of just one, to have a Social Security number, or else they won't be able to claim the credit. What that means is that the child tax credit is no longer available to families who have a U.S. citizen parent and whose other parent is here on some kind of visa, even if all of the children are citizens. So this is just more cruelty towards immigrants. It's a punishment for having one person in your family who is not a citizen. And the cruelty, it's all over this law. And maybe because this law is so cruel and immoral in so many ways, maybe because of that, there's a provision in here that is clearly designed to help Donald Trump's image and ego. Because the big, beautiful law creates investment accounts for babies that are literally named Trump accounts. Now, the way these will work is that for children born during the 4 years that make up the second Trump administration, there will be a one-time $1,000 deposit from the U.S. taxpayers put into each child's Trump account. The money has to then be invested in mutual funds or index funds and will be managed by a, quote, trustee, unquote. That's not the government. And that person or company will be picked by the Trump administration. And I'm sure they'll pick someone trustworthy who won't shower themselves with management fees. But these investment funds can't be withdrawn by the Trump years babies until they turn 18, although parents and relatives and employers can cumulatively add $5,000 per year on behalf of that child, and that's an amount that goes up each year with inflation. And, the accounts themselves, these are not a bad idea, but it's just such a sycophantic, let's honor our dear leader move for the Republicans to put Trump's name on them. It's like the Republicans in this Congress just love to tickle his balls. But my bigger concern about the Trump accounts is the long-term goal of them, because our Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, while speaking at a Breitbart policy panel, so while speaking in a room full of Republicans, he said this about the Trump accounts. He said, quote, "In a way, it is a backdoor for privatizing Social Security," unquote. He then explained, quote, "Social Security is a defined benefit plan paid out. To the extent that if, all of a sudden, these accounts grow and you have in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for your retirement, then that's a game changer too," unquote. And so the idea being articulated here is that they can point to these accounts and say, we don't need Social Security because these privatized accounts made the Trump babies money. And I've got to hand it to the Republicans. They play the long game on behalf of their Wall Street buddies, who have long wanted the massive fees and commissions that would come along with managing privatized Social Security accounts. And so just be aware of what they're doing here. While Trump accounts themselves don't seem nefarious, they might be a tool in a long-term plan to further erode our national safety net, this time the safety net for retirees. But back to the kids. While your kiddos are growing up, the big, beautiful law makes caring for them a bit more affordable, but only for relatively lower income Americans. So if you have a child or someone you take care of, like a family member who depends on you, the government sometimes gives you a tax break to help you cover the cost of things like daycare or babysitting while you work. Now, that amount was capped at 35% of those expenses in the most generous circumstances before the big, beautiful law. Now that cap is increasing to 50%, but only for people who make less than $15,000 per year, which is desperate poverty. For people who make between desperate poverty and $75,000 per year, that percentage phases down to 20%. And if you make more than $105,000 a year, you get nothing. But even if you do qualify, those percentages might not actually cover that percentage of your costs because there's a maximum credit of $3,000 if you have one dependent and $6,000 for two or more dependents. And the average childcare cost in the United States is $1,000 per month. And so a lot of parents are going to hit that cap pretty quick. Very few, it seems like, are going to make it even to the summer. And that's the only help in this law for parents that goes directly to the parents. Now let's get into the weirdly long list of tax credits for the bosses of American parents. So first, the Republicans increased the tax credit for employer-provided childcare to 40% of the company's expenses, up from 25%, and increased the maximum credit allowed to $500,000 per year or $600,000 per year for small businesses, which is defined as roughly one that makes $25 million per year. And that credit cap for businesses was increased from $150,000, so that's a pretty good increase. And the maximum credit will automatically increase with inflation. Another provision allows employers to get a credit for wages that they choose to pay to parents who need time off to care for their families or for the insurance premiums the employers choose to pay for family leave expenses. And starting in 2026, the Big Beautiful Law reduces the amount of time the employee must be on the job to be eligible down to 6 months, down from a year, and clarifies that part-time workers who work at least 20 hours a week are eligible as expenses for employers. But what irks me about these is that other countries don't let employers choose if parents can take time off for the birth of a child or for other familial reasons. Family leave is guaranteed in other parts of the world, and many other countries pay these benefits direct to the workers so that they don't have to be subject to the whims of their owners, their bosses. Because regardless of the credit, if a boss doesn't want to provide family leave, they still don't have to. But I do guess that incentivizing the boss to not be a Scrooge is an improvement in our weird wage slavery system. And I do have to say the Republicans made the credit permanent. But along similar lines, like right now, your boss is allowed, not required, but allowed to help you pay for things like daycare or after school care for your kids, or care for another person who depends on you so that you can work. And most commonly, it takes the form of a pre-tax payroll deduction. So like your employer allows you to set aside money tax-free from your paycheck to pay for the care, or it can be offered through a flexible spending account dedicated to dependent care. And in some cases, your employer may also directly reimburse you for eligible expenses or operate an on-site daycare. And before the Big Beautiful Law, if you were lucky enough to have a boss that chose to help you like this, you didn't have to pay taxes on up to $5,000 of that help each year. And starting in 2026, that limit goes up to $7,500. But if your boss doesn't choose to pay you in this way, even though in a lot of cases it costs them nothing, then no one gets that childcare subsidy. It just stays in the government's bank account. And then, after your child grows up and wants to go to college, there's a tax rule that can help them to do so, but only if their boss gets involved. Right now, employers can pay up to $5,250 per year towards an employee's student loans, and that money doesn't get taxed as income. The Big Beautiful Law makes this benefit permanent and says that the $5,250 limit will go up over time with inflation. But this only works if your employer chooses to give you this benefit. If your boss has the foresight to classify your pay as specifically for student loans and doesn't just pay you that amount in your paycheck. Your boss kind of has to be intertwined a bit in your personal life to even know you have a student loan situation for you to work out this payment plan. Because if you pay your student loans yourself directly to the bank and keep your boss out of your personal finances, you don't get this tax break. And it's like, why aren't student loan payments paid directly allowed to be excluded from income? Like, why must we beg pretty please to our bosses for this? I just find it gross that in the land of the free, we are dependent on our boss's generosity. And we have to get our bosses involved in managing our personal financing. Like, we have to depend on our boss for healthcare benefits and childcare credits and family leave credits and student loan credits. They all flow either directly or indirectly through our bosses to us. And for so many of them, only if the boss feels like it. It all just gives lord and serf vibes to me. And the big, beautiful law is marching us on the path towards that feudal system, not taking us on a path towards worker independence, a path towards freedom, despite the Republicans' insistence that they're all about freedom. They just don't seem to understand the meaning of that word, because being dependent on your boss, that ain't it. But moving on, none of the tax credits for parents and children matter if you're not a parent. And so this big, beautiful law does help people become parents. No, not by making in vitro fertilization free, like Trump promised over and over again on the campaign trail. Instead, they made the $5,000 adoption tax credit refundable, which means that people can get the money even if they have no tax bill to wipe away. And the credit will now increase with inflation. And that's going to apply for 2025 taxes. But while taking care of children is kind of a goal of many of these tax credits, there is a tax credit in here that will do the opposite. Because you may be aware that gun-related injuries are the number one cause of death of children in the United States. And yet, instead of discouraging the purchase and proliferation of handheld death machines, the Republicans eliminated a $200 tax on the sales of all firearms and firearm accessories like silencers. They also eliminated a tax paid by the manufacturers of those death machines. The tax is only going to remain on machine guns and so-called destructive devices like grenades and bombs. And so basically, the Republicans made it cheaper to buy guns, and therefore Republicans made us all less safe by putting more of these death machines into our communities. But at least when we donate to the GoFundMes for the dead kids who will be killed with guns, we'll get tax breaks for those donations. Because starting in 2026, for people who don't itemize their deductions, which is most of us, we can now deduct $1,000 per person in charitable contributions. So like if you donate $1,000 to a GoFundMe for a kid who got shot in the face at school, depending on what tax bracket you're in, you will pay between $100 and $370 less in taxes. But there are some notable organizations that will qualify as charity, and they include churches, private schools, and private foundations. So in effect, about $7.4 billion in tax money will be diverted from government to fund charities and also to fund religion, profitable schools, and shady oligarch money pits. And finally, the last crumb for us peasants is that starting in 2026, tax benefits for disaster victims that were only available if the disaster was federally declared will also be available for state-level disasters. And with Republicans doing all they can to increase the number of extreme weather disasters, this really is the least they could do. But that's not it for us peasants, because just like how the tax cuts for the wealthy and the tax cuts for the corporations were paired with some tax increases on the wealthy and tax increases on corporations that Republicans didn't like, well, they are increasing some of our taxes too. And just like with the other categories, the Republicans are going to make it more expensive for us to help with the global project to limit the rate of climate change. So first, Republicans permanently repealed a $20 a month credit that employers were able to offer us tax-free if we rode our bikes to work. Now we will be taxed on this as income if it's still offered by our bosses. And Republicans are going to let benefits for public transportation expire at the end of 2028. Also, in furthering their mission to keep us hooked on fossil fuel guzzlers, Republicans also killed a tax credit covering 30% of the cost for installing electric car charging stations, which was supposed to exist until 2032. The car charger tax credit will now end on June 30th, 2026. And so there's a bit more time left to get those installed. And so here's my advice. Buy your electric car now, like right now. Pause this episode and go to the dealer right this second, because you have to do this before the end of September, because that's when the tax credit for the electric vehicles expire. Then you can buy your car charger by early next summer. But just a reminder, not everyone qualifies for the EV charger tax credit. It's based on your location and it's weird. So I put a frequently asked questions in the show notes for you to help you find out if your home or business qualifies. But on top of that, Republicans also killed a 30% credit for up to $1,200 per year for energy efficiency audits and improvements in your home. So for things like new windows, new doors, water heaters, stoves. These credits were supposed to be available until the end of 2032. Now you only have until the end of this year. And for homeowners who knew about this, because I told you about these in detail in the Inflation Reduction Act episode, If you're a homeowner and you planned projects wisely over the course of the decade to maximize the credit allowance, this is a loss of $8,400 worth of home improvements for you on top of your higher energy bills. And if you want to move out of your energy inefficient old junker of a house, Republicans made moving more expensive for you too by permanently repealing the moving expense deduction starting in 2026. And on top of that, moving expenses provided by your boss who is making you move will now be treated as taxable income. The only people who will be able to deduct their moving expenses starting in 2026 will be members of the military, and the big beautiful law added intelligence agency spooks as well. But if you decide to move anyway, and you want to buy stuff for your new home, that stuff will likely be more expensive too, at least in the near future. Because starting on July 1st, 2027, items valued at under $800 will no longer be exempt from import taxes, and there are some financial penalties imposed on importers who try to get around these tariffs. This means we will probably pay more for items produced in other countries because the costs of these taxes will be passed on to us. Now, the idea behind this is to make foreign goods more expensive so that we will buy American-made products. But if there are no American-made products, we just pay more to cover the taxes of the companies. And if you think this entire U.S. economy is starting to feel like a rigged game, and so you think, fuck it, let's go to Vegas and see if we can get lucky, well, Republicans are going to make losing in the casino more expensive for you too. Because before the big beautiful law, gamblers could deduct their losses up to the amount of their winnings, so 100%. But now, instead of people being able to deduct 100% of their gambling losses from their taxes, the big beautiful law changes that to 90%. So what this means is that even if you break even, if you win $1,000 and you lose $1,000, instead of paying no tax because you broke even, you would have to pay taxes on $100 of your winnings because there's only a 90% match. Now, in reality, this will probably really only affect professional gamblers and rich people who itemize their taxes. But that group of elites is pissed about this. And reporters in Congress haven't been able to figure out how this got into the bill. No one's fessing up to it. And Nevada senators and representatives, they want a new bill called the Fair Bet Act to repeal this part of the big beautiful law. It's wild how fast members of Congress will act to fix things that rich people complain about. But I do have to say that the Fair Bet Act hasn't moved yet at all, so it's still out there. The rich people haven't gotten their way yet. But my point is that this is what happens when you vote on a bill and have no idea what's actually in it. Weird things that no one wants end up becoming law. But now that we've lost a bunch of money in Vegas and need our families and friends to send us money, depending on how they send it and where they send it from, that money transfer is about to get more expensive. Because starting in 2026, if we send cash, a money order, or a cashier's check internationally, there will be a tax on that transfer equal to 1% of the transfer amount. But you don't have to pay that tax if you send the money via a bank account or if you use a debit or credit card, which are what wealthy people generally use. And so the targets of this are clear. This is designed to tax immigrant workers who send money overseas to their families. And this is estimated to cost people sending money approximately $1 billion per year. Now, we're going to move on to Republican attacks on the educated. Before the big beautiful law, graduate and professional students were allowed to get federal loans that covered the full cost of our tuition and costs, called Graduate Plus loans. Those loans are just being disappeared starting in July of 2026. Also starting in July of 2026, there will be limits on the amounts that students and parents can borrow from certain federal student loan programs. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically, no graduate or professional student will be able to borrow more than $257,500 total from the federal government for student loans over the course of their entire education. Which means that unless schools lower their prices, students in professional or graduate programs may now need to rely on more scholarships or on their employers or on draining their savings or on private banks, which have higher interest rates and less flexible repayment plans in order to finance their futures. And this restriction in direct student borrowing from the government, it's going to save the government about $30 billion per year. Put another way, that's $30 billion per year that will be transferred into business for probably the private banks, or will simply result in fewer educated Americans who give up on their career dreams due to a lack of funding. And then when it comes to repaying student loans, effective July 1st, 2026, all federal student loan repayment plans will be canceled, and there will only be two options for repayment. So you can either have a fixed plan based on the amount you borrowed with a maximum 25-year payback for the largest loans, or you can have an income-based repayment plan taking between 1 and 10% of your income. Now, before this law, only people who could prove a financial hardship could opt for the income-based repayment plan. Effective immediately, all student loan holders can opt into that option. But importantly, the money that students will pay will first go to interest, then to fees, and then to principal. And this is how people end up paying back what they've borrowed in full over and over again and still find themselves in debt. You can pay for decades if it goes from interest to fees and then to principal and never see your principal go down. Overall, the changes made by the Big Beautiful Law limit students' repayment options because Americans indebted to the government for their education, they had 5 repayment plans before. And an effect of the stricter terms on the only 2 available repayment options is going to be that forgiveness of government student loans is going to take longer and it's going to be harder to get. And that limiting of student loan forgiveness is how this is going to end up saving the government, but costing students approximately $23 billion per year. $23 billion per year for a service, education, that is considered an expected return on taxes in other countries. On top of that, students receiving any federal student loan money on or after July 1st, 2027 will no longer qualify for deferments due to economic hardship or unemployment. And it also limits the duration of forbearance that's allowed to 9 months in any 2-year period, as opposed to indefinitely determined on a case-by-case basis, which was the situation before this big, beautiful law. And the Republicans don't just make education more expensive for the students. They also limit the students' choices of where they can spend their own debt. Because the Republicans prohibited federal student loans from paying for classes at a school for an undergrad, grad, or professional degree if the students who recently got degrees at that school are making less than the median earnings of other working-age adults in the same area with the same profession. The schools can appeal and reapply after 2 years, but the effect is that it makes education about money and devalues any degree that isn't focused on the highest financial return. And of course, that limits students' choices to spend their money at the school of their choice. So much for freedom. And then finally, the Biden administration had finished a few regulations that basically said that students with loans who spend their money at a school that misrepresented its offerings or failed to disclose something that was central to their decision to enroll. So like if the school guaranteed the students would get a certain job, or if it said that they'd be paid a certain amount, or if they were promised transferable credits when in reality the credits were junk, or if they were in the process of getting a degree at a school that closed before they finished, well, then those students would be entitled to debt relief for their student loans spent at the scam school. Now, the Republicans couldn't get away with repealing these regulations in the Big Beautiful Bill. The House actually tried to do it. And so instead, they prohibited the enforcement of this regulation for 10 years. And so while Republicans are policing real colleges who offer degrees that aren't promising riches, but do provide education about things that Republicans consider liberal or gay or whatever, and while Republicans put up financial hurdles to attending and paying for real graduate schools, they have simultaneously decided to financially punish students who, at no fault of their own, got scammed by a school that promised riches and delivered literally nothing. Which sure sounds like Trump University to me. Trump University was a real thing, but a fake university. Trump University was a for-profit company that never had a license to operate as an accredited school. And Donald Trump eventually had to settle with the state of New York for $25 million after he got sued for fraud, deceptive practices, and false advertising. So overall, it's like Republicans are punishing young people for being dumb enough to want to be educated and for becoming victims of con artists like Donald Trump. And this also helps the scam schools like Trump University, because the government will examine them less often since the law enforcers will no longer, or at least for the next 10 years, have to judge the claims of students seeking that student loan forgiveness. And so you see, just like with the provisions for the wealthy and corporations, we got some stuff and we lost some stuff. And overall, in my personal opinion, the crumbs I'm going to get in my bank account are not worth the massive holes blown in my safety net and the millions of lives that will be lost due to the lack of basic health care and food assistance, and the constant stress that we American workers feel in a country where working full-time so often just isn't enough to pay our most basic bills. But since both of my episodes on the Big Beautiful Law, at least to me, have been depressing as let's end this with my 5 favorite provisions in the Big Beautiful Law. 5, because that is the total number of provisions that ended up in my file labeled good stuff. And so number 5 on my list of good stuff, and I know I'm reaching with this one, but number 5 is that Republicans are going to buy some oil to put in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And so why is this in my good stuff folder? Well, we've seen the Strategic Petroleum Reserve used as a piggy bank for spending in laws many, many times over the years. And I've always considered it short-sighted to sell our emergency oil when there is no crisis from our emergency reserves. And right now, oil prices are not crazy high, and so it's a good time to put some oil back in our emergency bucket. And the Big Beautiful Law spends $218 million to repair the facility and $171 million to put more oil in it. So that's why I think it's good. Number 4 on my list of good stuff is that the Big Beautiful Law provides $1 billion for water storage facilities. Number 3 is that the Big Beautiful Law appropriates additional money to FEMA, but not for disaster relief. FEMA is going to get $500 million to help states detect drones, which I do think is a good thing. If you haven't heard, go listen to Congressional District 319, Beware the Drones, because I'm afraid of those little things. We are also going to see FEMA get $625 million to protect the World Cup and $1 billion for the 2028 Olympics. And I put this in good stuff mainly because it signals to me that the congressional Republicans are not serious about getting rid of FEMA. Then number 2 on my good stuff list is that the Big Beautiful Law expands who can get federal compensation for radiation exposure, but it also puts strict time limits on when people can file. So basically, survivors of nuclear weapons testing from the 1940s through the 1960s and uranium miners who are now dealing with cancers or other radiation-related illnesses are newly included in the beneficiaries for the healthcare. But if you qualify, you have to submit your claim by December 31st, 2027. The new law also covers people made sick by waste left over from the Manhattan Project, which was our nuclear bombs. And for the first time, the families of victims who have passed away can apply for those benefits. Now, this Manhattan Project provision only applies to certain zip codes in Missouri, Tennessee, Alaska, and Kentucky, and the deadline to file those claims is December 31st, 2028. And so this doesn't affect a lot of us, but it will be a life changer for the people that it applies to. And then finally, my favorite thing in the Big Beautiful Law is that it appropriates an additional $11.5 billion to upgrade our air traffic control system and allows them to use the money until the end of September 2029, giving them the time to do this upgrade wisely. They're going to be able to spend the money on telecommunications infrastructure, radar system replacements, runway safety and lighting upgrades, weather systems, and advanced training technologies, which should help the air traffic controllers get trained faster and help with our severe air traffic control shortage. And that is the happiest news that I've got. And so that's what's in the Big Beautiful Law. In total, this law is expected to increase the amount of money our government overspends each year, our deficit, by $3.4 trillion. And as for our debt, which is the amount we already owe to the world, mainly the banks, it's currently at over $36 trillion. And here's Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky on the Senate floor before the bill passed. He was one of only 2 Republican senators who voted no on this disaster.
In addition, the bill increases the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. What does that mean? That is an admission that they know they aren't controlling the deficit. They know that the ensuing years will add trillions more. So we're adding $2 trillion this year, but they're anticipating, the authors of the bill anticipating adding more than $2 trillion next year. That doesn't sound at all conservative to me, and that's why I'm a no.
And I just hope after this, the Republican Party is never considered fiscally responsible ever again. And shame on everyone who voted for this law. Shame on them for the fiscal recklessness and the cruelty and the damage this will do to our health and to the entire world. And I sincerely hope that the 265 congressional Republicans who did this to us are loudly booed everywhere they go for the rest of their disgraceful lives. So I really want to thank you for the Venmos and Zells and PayPals that have been coming in since I released the first half of the Big Beautiful Bill episodes. They really helped me get through this one because out of the two, this was the hardest of the two episodes, as you might imagine, because thinking of tax policy for weeks on end and trying to figure out how to explain it sucks. So every time I heard the Venmo dings, and there were a lot of them, it kept me going. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for supporting the show. I am really, really proud of this work, especially on episodes like this. And I'm also really proud of how many executive producers we already have on the episode that we just released, the first half of the Big Beautiful Bill, which we are labeling a dangerous law. We have, like I said, 4 executive producers. So thank you to Stephen McMahon, Sean Newman, Amy Holland, and Mike Coverdale. I am so happy to share the byline of that episode with you and with 4 executive producers. That makes that episode already number 6 on the most valuable episodes list. So it just takes one more executive producer on that episode to get it into the top 5. So I'm pretty excited to see if we can get that there, because I do think that's one of the more important episodes that I've ever done, even more important than this one. I know that the tax stuff does affect us directly, but the other things that we talked about in the dangerous law episode the thing I think about the most is the legalization of indefinite detention of adults and children on United States soil. I just think that is beyond horrible. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the most important episodes we've ever done. And Mike Coverdale actually added his name to a second episode. So he's also going to be an executive producer on Congressional Dish 149 called Fossil Fuel Foxes. That was an episode from the first Trump administration about the foxes in the hen house when it came to our energy departments. It was talking about the people that had been appointed to those positions. And so Mike also sent in a message along with his executive producer credits. And so what he said is, "Good evening. I hope you're both well. Because he sent it in to me and my sister. My sister Lauren is the one who does all the accounting for Congressional Dish. But he said, I just listened to the latest We're Not Wrong podcast, and in the listener comments, there was the climate change discussion. And like always, I'm so glad you are in that group to make the points that you do. LNG as a transition fuel is not a solution. I know I could write to We're Not Wrong, but it seemed out for a listener comment on a listener comment. But that episode reminded me of your fantastic episode, Congressional Dish 149, which I would like an executive producer credit on. I believe in this episode, and you point out that the EPA stopped requiring the monitoring and or capture of vented natural gas during the fracking process. So much raw methane is going straight into the atmosphere, and it is magnitudes worse than car exhaust. Like so many other issues, if it isn't reported, then it's not happening, right? So responding to Mike's note, you obviously couldn't have listened to this episode before writing that note. But yeah, what Trump did with regulations in his first term, the Republicans just did with the Big Beautiful Law, because they stopped the reporting of the methane emissions. So you're absolutely right. You're more right than you realized. But back to Mike's note, he said, I would also like an executive credit on your last episode on the big bastard bill. I shared it with over 100 Facebook groups, and it is getting reshared much more than past episodes. I'm glad someone took the time to actually read the bill, since most of the people we elected to represent us did not before voting, and probably most didn't after voting either. Yeah, unfortunately, Mike, I think you're right about that. I think they're just moving on. But thank you so much for sharing that episode. And I would actually really appreciate it if you guys could share this episode not only with your friends and family and the Facebook groups. That's such a great place to put it on social media. But if you could share it with some of the big podcasters as well. I was listening to, I don't know if I've told you guys this already, but I was listening to Professor Galloway, Scott Galloway. He's got a bunch of podcasts now. He does Pivot and Raging Moderates and the Prof G show, I think is what it's called. I don't know. But he was talking about how they were looking for guests, that they're always looking for guests. And he likes entrepreneurs and people who are doing interesting things. And I think I fall into that category, but I'm just not on anyone's radar. I also know that Mehdi Hassan has created his own media network, Zateo. And I just feel like if I were introduced to these people, if they knew what I was doing, especially with reading the details of this law, I think they might be interested in some of the stuff that hasn't been covered more widely. So if you guys could reach out to them, because I know that me reaching out does nothing. But if the audience for these shows tells them that they want to hear from a certain guest, that's how I get invited on these shows. And that's how we can spread the word about this a bit wider. But yeah, thank you so much for supporting this show. This is one of those episodes that was tough to do, but I'm really proud to have done it, and I couldn't have done it without you. Also, people I couldn't have done this without are Claire, who is my production and research assistant. And I would also like to thank Pro Podcast Solutions. Their editing has been the best decision I've ever made. They make my life so much easier. Thank you, Mark, at podcastbranding.co for your web design and security. Thank you, Lauren, my executive producer services specialist, which is a position we completely made up. Thank you to my dad, who does our taxes and keeps me sane. And thank you to our guardian angel, Brian Karras, because every time I do the AI art, I still feel like my guardian angel is involved in it somehow. And by the way, his art is still what we are selling on the TeePublic page. So it's our store for all the merchandise. So I got a bunch of t-shirts, but I also got a mug. And Brian's masterpiece, we both agreed on this before he died, was the episode for the CARES Act. But he had worked so hard on the art on that because there was no ChatGPT before then. So he did it by hand. And it's of a Care Bear, and the Care Bear looks like Stephen Mnuchin, who was the secretary at the time, the Treasury Secretary. It was just so well done, and I loved it. And so I created a mug out of it, and that's what I drink my tea out of most of the time. And it's just, he was such a brilliant artist, and I miss him so much. But I love that mug so much because I think of him and just like what an amazing artist he was. And so he's watching down on us, and I know he would have loved these episodes. So yeah, thank you to everyone. And I will be back in a few weeks with a summary episode of what has happened in the first 6 months of the 119th Congress. All right. Talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.